Welcome to Wise Up Governance and Boards podcast, brought to you by 3 Wise Owls Governance Consultants. Covering hot topics in governance, risk, latest regulatory changes, and issues keeping directors and executives awake at night. Here are your hosts, Ainslie Cunningham and Deb Anderson.
Welcome to today's episode of Wise Up. Today we're joined by Lisa Cameron de Vries from Phoenix Resilience. So Lisa has a Masters of Science in Industrial Engineering and nearly 2 decades of relevant experience in the design, implementation and verification of resilience programs, business continuity, risk, physical and information security, QHSE and emergency management for organisations based in Europe, Middle East, East Asia and Australia. These organisations were spread across a large variety of industries. 9 years ago, Lisa moved to Australia where she co-founded Phoenix Resilience. Phoenix Resilience has grown quickly to be the go-to partner for resilience services across the sectors government, finance, health, education, utilities, agriculture, not-for-profit, aged care and information technology. Since the start of this year, Lisa has been assisting government agencies and commercial organisations with their COVID-19 preparedness, response and recovery. Lisa is a regular guest speaker at national and international conferences and technical meetings. Wow, what an impressive bio, Lisa. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction.
So tell us a bit about Phoenix Resilience.
Phoenix Resilience is a company that provides the services throughout the cycle of resilience across the disciplines of resilience as we see it. We all are about integrated systems. So those disciplines you mentioned, health, safety, risk management, business continuity, emergency management, all those things have similar setup. If you go to the ISO standards, they have a similar setup of the way they are structured. It's just the specifics around that discipline. So we integrate those systems and then go through the life cycle. So we do an impact assessment or a gap analysis, and then the recommendations paper, then we develop the documents and implement the systems and infrastructure assistance where required. Then we do the implementation side of things, which is the training and any support and communication and changing culture. And then also the testing and the exercising and to see if it's effective, what has been implemented, and assist with any improvements that are required. So as you can see, that's the whole plan, do, check, act cycle of we follow through. But sometimes we're just called in to do an incident investigation, just an after action review, just an exercise, just a training program. So that's what we do. Great.
So on the show today, you wanted to chat about collaboration. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's been kind of one of those things that has always really stood out for me as being an obstacle for many organizations. I've worked for large corporations and with large corporations, and when you come in there's so many different risk registers. There's so many different silos doing something, trying to work towards a common goal, but they're not really working towards a common goal. And you will see, go to a risk meeting and different risk meetings, and you will see some people are putting a risk treatment measure in place for something that already the executive knows not going to continue anyway, but the communication is not there. So this point made me do research on integrated systems, and that's when I just came to Australia, did that research. That's what I've been presenting on back then, which is a 5-step plan to organisational resilience, which is all about a concept of how those disciplines come together, work together, and really get a good understanding of their context. And that's just been like the thread basically through my career, because that's been going on with all the projects we've been doing. It's about multi-agency response, and then a recent paper that we collaborated on was also because this COVID-19 response. What I saw was that organizations were basically panicking sometimes and taking their decisions. And if they had sat down with a group from members of their organization and they had consulted them, okay, so what do you see as the situation? What do you see? What options do we have? What would that mean for the organization? What do you think this situation is going to play out like? And you talk to legal, HR, IT, safety, everyone. Then you can get a good path to a good decision because you've assessed it from all angles. But if you jump the gun, then you might have not considered certain legal impacts, certain people impacts, certain technology impacts. Oh, we're all going to work from home. Oh, actually, we can't work from home because technology is not caught up with that yet. Or we are going to do this, but no, you can't actually do that because that's not legally possible. Or you can't do that because that's not safe. So those decisions, then you roll them out already, you announce them, and then you have to retract them. And there's just so much more effective ways to do this. And that's why I started as well the paper on collaboration. If you come into a crisis or an incident, just get the right people in the room and really think about, okay, what options do we have and how do we make a good decision?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those big frustrations in a lot of organisations where you see strategy development is one of them, where you might have the board and your executive leadership team just be in charge of developing strategy, and then there's sort of a disconnect between the implementation and that sort of communication feedback loop and all of those different moving parts, and everything else underneath that sort of operationalises off, say, one strategic direction that everyone's agreed on, and then all of a sudden there's a change in strategic direction and everything else hasn't been updated to reflect that. And so you might end up with a whole heap of old risks on the risk register that are redundant. Yeah.
Yes, or if you go down a new project or a business development, new opportunity, and don't update your risk framework with that, then you're just going to miss key risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, one of the things that you see is a lack of training and awareness. So a lot of people who might be charged with the responsibility of owning the relevant risk further down the line, they actually don't understand how it feeds into an overall risk profile or risk appetite statement, or what it actually means to either treat that risk, avoid it, transfer it, mitigate it in some way. And there's sort of a real disconnect there. And I think training and awareness is a really key driver.
Yeah, and we generally start with doing a context map. Because every standard says you have to map the context, and then there's some generic statement at the beginning of the risk procedure. We are a company that does this, yada yada yada. But it's not really mapping the context. So what we do, we just look at, okay, this is the process in the key steps, the value chain to deliver your product, and these are the support functions that make that happen. So you've got your primary process, we call it engineering, and then your support process like HR, finance, and any of those sort of things. You saw that in the paper as well. How they interrelate to each other. And if you can map that, then everyone can see how it fits together, and then you make people responsible for certain aspects of the risk. And that's what we do in our risk register, that instead of having this long page that does have a column with who's responsible for it, but it kind of makes it hard to, get that set, we make each page for each risk owner, and that's their page that they own, with risks in relation to the supply chain and all internal risks, but that's their bit, and they understand that in order to achieve these things or to treat those risks, they are dependent on others, because that's always out. But I don't totally own this. Yes, but you still depend on others. But by having that page, that they own that page, and then it's very clear. I'm responsible for this. It says clearly the scope. These risks are in there, and then they come together with that group. And everyone talks about their page, which covers the whole organization because you've done your context map. And they have to talk about and integrate those risks. So that's across business units as well as disciplines. So then you make sure that it's all integrated.
Yeah,
so
definitely. And I think too, when you have the board sort of set the appetite from the top-down approach, and then you've sort of got this bottom-up approach for risk ownership, it's sort of the bit in the middle that's not really quite gelling. Mm-hmm. And as risks become splintered throughout the organisation, there's sort of no high-level owner. So as you say, if you have it sort of on one page, there becomes an ultimate risk owner to sort of have that reporting line back up to the board on risk appetite, and also tracking that to a strategic goal. And, at what point are you at risk of not being able to achieve your strategy?
Yes.
Is really where it comes back to.
And that's always an interesting one, because, for example, take health and safety. On a strategic level, the executive are responsible that the resources and the time and the knowledge is available to maintain a health and safety management system, for example. That's the strategic objective. Now, the people then within their risk registers have to make sure that they don't introduce any hazards, and whatever they do, they mitigate their hazards. That's their operational level. So you can't say health and safety risks sit with the health and safety person. No, the the ability to have an effective health and safety management systems. That sits with the executive. So the risk is that they don't have one, or that it's not being achieved, and then that other component sits within each operational division. So I think that's a good way to explain it, because that's always a difficult one where people just go, "Oh, you're the health and safety. The health and safety sits here." Because if you look at those risks, because I used to work for a military contracting company, and we worked in very hazardous areas, like we worked operating in Afghanistan. So you're looking at risk. Now there's risk where we had multi-casualty terrorist attack, air crashes, incidents, supply chain disruption, product quality issues, all sorts of things like that go wrong. Those risks of those things occurring have an effect on your it could have legal impacts, operational impacts, financial impacts, reputational impacts. So you can't say that a terrorist attack sits in the emergency management side or something. Yes, that's the response, that's a risk treatment. But the risk of it occurring and having those systems in place, making sure that you're prepared, goes all the way from the top down.
So in your experience, how do you instill, from a cultural perspective, the importance of risk management?
I always try to make it relevant to that specific organization. So we work with a lot of different organizations, from NGOs organizing events to investment funds to power companies so you have to contextualize it to that. So for example, take an NGO organizing an event. They're, for example, very well-meaning people, often volunteers, with maybe limited risk awareness. They think, oh, the risk is tripping or falling over. Okay, so then we start with, before we do any design of risk management or any risk registers or whatever, we do the awareness workshop where you put on these news stories of things that go wrong on events, what the consequences are of that, what the implications are. And especially for an NGO, if you're trying to raise money and unfortunately somebody tragically gets hurt in that process, that's your brand, you will never be able to, like, people don't want to give to a charity that's associated with such a horrible thing, so that's the whole future of your charity compromised by something that so could easily occur, because there's so many events and people so enthusiastically go, oh, we'll all put so many people on a bicycle and just send them on their merry way. But there's a lot of risk that can come with that. So the organizations that we work with luckily recognize that. And then we get the rest of the team on board by doing first that awareness and showing all these risks that are out there. And then they're quite going, for a bit there, they get the whole, this is terrifying, how are we going to do this? And then you take them on the journey to implement the risk treatment strategy. So you show them, okay, so which one are your highest risk, which one are lower ones? These are all the opportunities you have to treat your risk, and these are the things we're going to put in place. And then you start people to get excited about, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this briefing, and then I'm going to tell these people, and oh yes, no, and I bought these safety vests, and people start to get really enthusiastic because they see their risk ratings drop, and then they get rewarded. And that's what we always explain in management. Okay, that's excellent. So they get positive feedback for treating their risk ratings, treating their risks. And then you slowly start to see a whole risk culture. And those customers that, but we like to call it partners, because you start off, for us, it's an ongoing relationship of a friendship. But you come in there now, and people are excited to tell you about, oh, we've now implemented this and that, and they've just taken your ideas and on a whole next level of risk treatment. And that is just so good to see. I've literally seen the biggest doubters of risk management get completely enthusiastic about risk management and seeing that it has a benefit for their organization, that you actually, because people during these risk meetings get the opportunity to also to share some of the concerns that they have. And they are really good concerns, as in everyone should be aware of that, because you can easily do something about that when you raise it in a meeting 3 months before the event. But some people they wouldn't raise it if they didn't get that platform. Because, nobody wants to be that person that says, oh, are you sure about that? If the CEO is really excited about an idea. But if there's this risk place where everyone can say, well, I think that I'm concerned about this, and that's being acknowledged and recorded somewhere, and then maybe addressed, and then you see that people go, oh, this is actually really positive and good. And so that positivity, and that people see that this really works for me, and then because the director says that, then it works through everything, and they see that there's positive outcomes, and that they see the value increase of their own business because they're mitigating all these risks. So I think that's really what it's about.
Do you see any directors or boards or even executive teams become negative towards risk when they see that the cost treatment is potentially outweighing the benefit in their eyes?
Well, that's always a good one, because I do, and that always comes down again to knowledge and training and awareness and experience, because the person might be appointed to design the risk treatment strategy, might not necessarily be the person that has the most experience or knowledge on the best option, and might go with a really expensive option, and so I think it's good for boards to say, okay, have you done your assessment of different options? Where's your options analysis to treat this risk? And if you delve into that, then don't just accept it and go down an expensive path, because often it doesn't need an expensive measure. And I think that's very good. So I think that's maybe sometimes where it's lacking in the presentation for a risk treatment strategy.
Yeah, I think too, a lot of risk owners undersell the benefit to the board.
Yes, and that's another one. You have to be really good at that. And if you're a technical person, you might not necessarily, you just have that in your head. You know, some people are just really not good at explaining something. They have it all in their head, and to them it makes perfect sense. But if that's not your daily job, you need to be really talked through what the benefits might be and how this will benefit the organisation in the short term, medium term, long term, and you need to have that strategic vision. That's a lot of skill and knowledge and experience, or even a skill that some people will never have, that you have to have in order to get that across the line.
It almost even becomes a sales pitch.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So the person that will get the most funding for their project might not be the one that has the best project, but just the one that's the best at selling it. So that's why not always the people that have the highest salary are the people that are best at their jobs. They're just better at selling themselves.
Do you find that clients come to you reactionary, so they've had some episode and they reach out to you because they need help, or are they being more proactive and seeking your help at an earlier stage?
It varies. There's one group that comes to us because they were told by a board, or they were told by a regulator that they needed to update their system. Then there's the group that is concerned about risk and doesn't feel that as a leadership team feel that they're not addressed sufficiently. So that is great, because then they recognize it and they want to do it. So that's a really good starting point. And then the third one is when there's been an incident or a looming disaster. and then it's all about really getting a quick understanding of what the situation is. But we that's the most difficult one, clearly, because damage has been done, and then it's just about mitigating the consequences.
And how do you find, when you go in and work with teams and you position risk and you raise their level of awareness and you kind of help them sort of analyse all their risks and develop risk registers and things like that, do you find there's a real struggle there in terms of a knowledge piece of how to really draw out from them around their lead and lag indicators that will kind of be industry specific, that will help them sort of map risk in a more active risk management framework?
So that you're saying that they, when there's a change, that they understand how that could influence, which factors could increase the risk, which factor could reduce the risk?
More so which ones will help highlight the risk. So say if you're sort of going on a risk trajectory, you've got you've taken a certain level of risk appetite, you might be in sort of an amber zone of risk, and you might be have sort of indicators there that you've got to be monitoring from a risk reporting perspective, and a lot more lead indicators. So in terms of being in the forefront of that risk sort of coming into fruition, so that they can get on it quite early and reduce that risk as it's sort of coming into, say, maybe a red zone or even a catastrophic level. Do you find that's quite difficult to get organisations to increase their awareness of?
Well, that's the whole point, what we started with the 5-step plan to organisational resilience. That is about the awareness. And that's the tool that's in there is all about raising that awareness and having that monitoring capability. That's also the first thing we do. You have to have a monitoring capability within your organisation that understands if this changes, then our risk profile changes. So, for example, in the taxi industry, this is a very much used example, but in the taxi industry, people could have known if they had a monitoring capability, oh, this technology is coming up, oh, these apps are coming up, there will be a competitor entering the market in a totally different strategy. So when Uber came into the market, but there was not such a monitoring capability. Everyone was going, taxis will be taxis, there will be taxis forever, and this will just be that. And they were just, it came like a complete surprise to the taxi industry. While if somebody was monitoring, if I was running a taxi business, wouldn't be monitoring, okay, that's what technology is going this way, or these developments are coming up, or if they apply that in the taxi industry, we could be in trouble. So maybe think about having apps in our business and going on that technology train early as well, instead of completely reactive, asking for government handouts and being all upset about what's happened to them. Every business is going to go through a major disruption at some point. That is your responsibility as a business owner or an executive, that you are aware of those potential threats that could occur, and that you are monitoring them, and that you have a capability in-house to, if this changes and that happens, then this increases our risk profile in this way, and the consequences could be this. We need to take action, yes or no. To say it very, very simply. And that is complete key, because we always say the earlier you detect a change that could potentially cause a problem, the more time you give yourself to prepare for it. And it doesn't have to be some complex thing. It doesn't have to be, we immediately have to invest lots of money. But like with this Uber thing, if you early in, you can come up with a strategy, you can get really smart people together, you can really think about what your competitive strategy could be, where we're going to be for the future, what's the future going to look like, and all those things really should be in place. So that you don't stand there with your hands in the air going, what happened?
I think you see that a lot too with change management. When you get a new CEO or a new board or a new management team, they sort of come in and want to clear the decks and review strategy, sort of more of a holistic front, reviewing that macro environment and things like that. Whereas if you have, I guess, boards and ELTs that have had a long tenure, they really become complacent and they become so firmly fixated on their strategic vision that they don't want to see in the peripherals what else might be coming into the horizon, and really gets missed.
Yeah, and also a lot of, and that's just human nature, work off the things that they've experienced. So if you've been through a flood, you're focused on flood. If you've been through a terrorist attack, you're totally focused on that. If you've been through this experience of a cyber attack, for example, then you know what needs to be in place to be prepared for a cyber attack. If it never really happened to you, then, you kind of, it's difficult if somebody comes to present to the board, yes, we put this and this in place, to really scrutinize that. If you've not really been through it, because you don't really know what maybe the right questions are to ask. So in that case, and that's a very, very difficult task for a board, because they need to be across all the things that could potentially go wrong with an organization, and also be across what an organization should have in place to mitigate those specific things. And the current environment, like with pandemics and terrorist attacks and technology, complete reliance on technology, I mean, the threats horizon is very, very significant. So that's always a challenge for a board to be across all those different things that can go wrong, and really scrutinize what someone's telling them that is being done, because clearly everyone's going to sit there, yeah, that's really, really fantastic. And that's why in business continuity and emergency management, we do testing of everything. Okay, you say you can send out a bulk text to all customers. Okay, well, can we test that? Or at least to the whole incident management team. Can we test that actually works? Or when we send everyone home to work from home, can we test that actually all those people can log in at the same time and have access, and they can function? And does that really, really work? And when most, I would say maybe 99 out of 100 times it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of organisations just do, desktop or soft testing of their BCP and DRP, except they don't really actually do that sort of hard live tests regularly, or if at all.
It's just been enforced on everybody recently, though, hasn't it?
Yeah.
How effective is your BCP? Was your BCP?
Yes. Now everyone will, and then that's the thing now, because everyone in an executive role and a board role has now been through this. They've seen it. So now all of a sudden they realise, especially now, the importance of a good, robust business continuity plan. that is ready to deal with a disruption of any size and scale and complexity. But then it comes all down to having an agile system, because in no way should I ever promote that you should have a 500-page business continuity plan that thinks of every possible scenario that could go wrong. It needs to be something that's really flexible and agile, that is able to deal with any specific situation, because as we now know, no situation is ever going to play out exactly like you have planned. And so where people said, oh, no one will ever be sent home for 2 months, or no one, the internet will always be here, or those sort of things in your business, those assumptions that are being made. But there's so many different disruptions. Oh, I have no internet, or I have no this or that. It just needs to be an agile plan that's able to respond to a disruption or an incident, as we also talk about, of any size, scale, complexity. Because those long plans, they're the worst.
I think people get a bit complacent, don't they? You have your business continuity plan in place and you go, oh, look, put it in the drawer and forget about it. But this is just brought to the fore how important that they are.
And what I find most remarkable, because what large organizations generally do is they determine, okay, what are the critical services maybe for the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, and then send that down to the business units, and they complete their own BCPs in isolation. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a value chain going through an organization, right? Division A cannot do without input from C and input from B, and then D needs something from that in order to have for that value chain to deliver something at the end, right? So how can you develop BCPs in isolation and then think that that's magically going to work? And you have these massively long BCPs. You go into this organization and each division has this massively long BCP. Well, all you need is this overarching business continuity capability that is able to understand, okay, this is the type of disruption, these are our recovery priorities for an organization, and then cascade that decision-making down. That's in my opinion, because that's just much more flexible and agile.
Well, it's more user-friendly too. Like, how many times do you see IT departments suddenly get charged with the responsibility for managing it? And you go, so no, actually what happens is you have a risk manager, you have potentially your CEO, representative from the board, and you position those teams, that crisis response team, based on the situation at hand. And that's
It's different.
Yeah, it's different every time, right? Like if it's a IT system, yeah, definitely get the IT guy. If it's something else, a HR situation, then definitely a HR person needs to be involved. If it's a people management situation or prevention of access, you might want more the office manager, or is there a alternative location that they can set up, or things like that. So yeah, it's definitely got to have the flexibility to be able to call on those response teams.
Yeah, and the good one that you mentioned with the IT, because we see that a lot. For example, one of the key systems has an outage. The IT department will put their heads in their computers to try and fix it. But somebody needs to look up and go, this system is out. That means that this one might also be out. That means that we can't deliver these and these services. That means we have to communicate to these and these people. That means that we might not meet these legal requirements. That means, and have that sort of thinking, and then update the executive. Okay, we're doing this, we're having this in place. Because if you don't start updating on what's going on, they all start coming there. So you're sitting in your IT department trying to get this system back up, and there's the CEO, and there's the director of this, and there's the director of that, all going, what's going on, what's going on, what's going on. So you need to have that overarching capability that has that incident management capability to understand what communication needs to go out, how decisions need to be made, so that the people that can fix it, which can be the infrastructure people, the facilities management people, the IT people, that they can sort it out.
Yeah. And I think too, what you find is a lot of the time they don't even have a draft communication plan, and so then they're scrambling to say, well, what sort of messaging do we need, and who should release it, and where should we release it?
Who should approve it?
Yeah.
And before you know it, something's gone out, it hasn't been approved.
Yeah.
Because we've seen that, for example, was it the Dreamworld event where, what was it, day 2, they announced, we'll be open on Friday, and it will be, the money will be donated here and there. Actually, it's a crime scene, and you won't be opening for a while. And so this communication has gone out. It has not been at all, in my opinion, probably approved or really sanity checked by the incident management team, because otherwise you would know that that's not an option. that you can actually do that. So and we see that all the time. People jump the gun, start saying all sorts of things to promises, and we're going to do this. Well, it's just probably best to say, okay, we have had an incident, we're assessing all the options, and if you don't have a solution, don't make one up. Just say that. We're working very hard on it, and we acknowledge what has happened.
Yeah, definitely. I think honesty sort of comes into it there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of your improving resilience in the aged care sector, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we've been fortunate enough, because I'm really passionate about this, clearly. These are very vulnerable members of our community, and they are in a very vulnerable position. And if people don't come to help them, then they won't be able to help themselves. And there's all sorts of things that can go wrong, clearly, for in aged care, what we saw now, pandemic, but also fires, bushfires, floods. In the US, we have seen horrific photos of aged care residents sitting waist high in flood water, and those horrific things. So the thing with an aged care facility, the resources they have available to them is clearly not to the level that they're independently able to respond to an incident of any scale, because that's unaffordable. So they would not be able to evacuate all the residents within the set time frame. Like if a bushfire is coming in, you have 3 hours and you have 300 residents, no facility has the ambulances and all that available to get those people out. And we have learned from previous events that there may be limited ambulances available anyway, because if they're responding to other facilities, if it's 3 facilities under threat at the same time, they might not be able to respond. So those sort of contextual considerations are critical in emergency planning. There's not just one size fits all. Oh, we'll get them to the front door and somebody will magically come and get them. Because that's how a lot of plans work. We'll get them to the front door and then emergency services will take over. But we've seen in the past they are doing other things. They maybe have one ambulance if you're lucky, and that it's just not going to work. So what we've also seen is that they turned up to evacuation centers with their residents. Now that's also something that if you do planning beforehand, realize because residents living with dementia need to be in a secured perimeter. You cannot offer that in an evacuation center. So they pose a threat to the public in the evacuation center as well as to themselves. They get very distressed. So then you need medical staff there. The requirements for looking after the aged, clearly they've got medical records that they need. They've got all sorts of specific requirements around sanitation and treatment and feed, like the type of food that they can have, the type of drink that they can have. It's endless requirements. So an evacuation centre is a completely unacceptable place for aged care residents, if they're high care, to go. So that was all recognised. So a lot of councils went through the idea of doing a multi-agency approach, and we were lucky enough to assist one of the regional councils here in Queensland to get in the room aged care facilities and their critical supply. So you're thinking of medical centres, hospitals, GPs, Queensland Health, emergency services, the ambulance, QFAS, and all get them in the room and talk about, okay, so these are the kind of resources we have available in this particular region. This is what our response would be. This is type of threats, and really come up with a group and build those relationships so that they understand, okay, there's 3 ambulances in this region, there's 5 aged care facilities. If there's a large, like a flood coming through at a rapid pace, we'll be pretty much on our own. So can we maybe collaborate between the aged care facilities? Because for this particular case, there was a river in the middle, and if it floods, the staff for the one facility is on the one side, but the staff, the other facility, so if their staff either can't come to their facility, but if they could share with the other facility, they could keep them running, right? So those sort of things you only identify by sitting all together in a room. And the same with medical centres and how you can do workarounds if there's a disruption with food supply and any of those sort of things. So when COVID-19 was starting to come on the radar, we got that same group together and came up with an incident action plan for this particular scenario, and where all the contacts are in there, this is our responses, and that they're all on the same page, and you report to health like this, and if you have an issue, we set in different levels of criticality in their response. So if you're running out of PPE, then you get to this level of criticality. If your staff gets sick to this much percentage, then you get to, so that all aged care facilities have a a rating of their criticality so that the local disaster coordinator can see, okay, this is where I'm at, kind of a dashboard, I suppose, and can see which aged care facilities are starting to struggle so that you can be really proactive in coming up with measures instead of somebody rings one day going, I'm run out of all stock, all my staff's sick, I need an evacuation now. So like we saw at the Earl Haven facility, no one was aware what was going on there until the staff walked off the job, literally left those people behind, and somebody called the emergency services. Not even those people, somebody. Like that is, we never want to get to that point.
No, it's
so
unacceptable.
that's why we want to get all these groups together going, okay, so if there's a dispute between a service provider, human resource provider, that is detected early and that the systems are in place between all these facilities to assist each other and with emergency services and with local providers to come up with a quick response so that these residents never, like, I mean, people were walking like through the hallways with like soiled themselves. It was horrific. It was horrific. And in this day and age, we can never let it get to that point. So most councils luckily are going through this path. We've been so fortunate to be part of that for this particular council. And I think that's the way to go. But I think that's the way to go for a lot of organizations, understanding that you're part of an ecosystem and working with those partners. Because that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about as well, is about just doing the right thing about your partners, your suppliers, your service providers, all the organizations that I worked for and worked with. Make sure that you have these really close relationships. And you help them, they help you. You'll be available every time, because those are the people that when the chips are down will also be there. And that's been for me. I needed a graphic design on Saturday night for a proposal for Monday morning, and because I have such a close relationship with all our partners, I can get that done. But they would do this. I would do the same for them if they need me for something else. And I think that ecosystem where you all need each other to get to the other end. I think that's recognizing that is very much crucial in how you survive and thrive through crises.
Absolutely.
I think you see that, like in New York and Central Park, where they've had to, they set up the makeshift hospitals and things. So
Yeah, absolutely.
that was probably not in anybody's
Ever.
planning.
No. Or mass graves in New York.
Yeah.
Who would have ever, and not even in the worst pandemic movies, horror movies that we've seen, would you ever see that sort of thing you have to consider?
Yeah, and you see the, the funeral directors and funeral parlours talking about their capacity as well, saying that, they don't even have enough coffins and supplies themselves, and you just don't even think of the ripple effect down to that granular level. When you're planning for these sorts of things, you never plan for those sorts of things.
But that's the point. So if you have an incident management capability that is really good at that, so to understand, okay, these are going to be the consequences, we're going to have lots of deaths. In order to process those, what do we need? We need, what do you call it, the processing homes, you need the graves, you need this and that, and you understand all those resources that you would need. Then you identify how much do we have available, are there any gaps, what do they need in order to achieve their outcomes? And are there any gaps? If you've done that there and you map that clearly with a centralized incident management team that has the authority to deal with it, then you can be proactive. Yeah. And now you're reactive, because all these new problems keep popping up and they keep going, I hadn't thought of that, I suppose. But
you would have had lead indicators earlier on and earlier
Absolutely.
detection processes to go, okay, well, we knew we only had this many funeral parlours in the area. They all have this many coffins. And so now as we see an increase and spike in death rates, then we know by default we're going to need X amount more and start
preparing
getting
for
that
that
in early.
And that was exactly what Australia did really, really well. They tried to flatten the curve early so that, because they knew if this hits this target of deaths, we need this many of this, we need this many of that, and they started to get that all in place, keep the curve flat and get that all in place, that if it hits, we've got it all ready. And that was really, really, hats off, that disaster management was excellent.
I think too they realised quite early on they didn't have enough PPE to even facilitate this. No. So if that plan didn't come off, maybe plan B or C or D was not going to ever be effective because they just didn't have access to it. So then you actually end up seeing an opportunity in the market for other suppliers that might not have even, new entrants that using their 3D printers and developing safety masks, and gin companies developing hand sanitizer and, thinking outside the box and really just seeing that opportunity to fill those gaps.
And that's what I find the wonderful thing of any disaster. There's always an opportunity linked to it. And that's why it's so important for organizations to understand, okay, this looks really, really bad, but what are we good at? And how can we, like the very old example, for example, of Holden. It used to be a saddlery company, like making saddles for horses and stuff. And then very successful. But then the car was introduced. So nobody needs a saddle. So they could have gone, oh, well, that's the end of us. Let's pack up, go home. But then they started to think, okay, so what are we really, really good at? Okay, good at working with leather. Okay, well, we started making the seats for the car. And that's how they become Holden, right? So, and that was until recently very successful here in Australia. So that's the thing of thinking, okay, this looks really bad, but I can really turn this to my advantage by just feeling really smart about what the opportunities are. What are you good at, and how does that work in this particular situation?
Yeah, it's when that saying, never waste a crisis, comes into play, doesn't it?
Yeah. But that's really, really good.
So in terms of panic response, so with your collaboration in the aged care sector, how far and wide are they really considering? Are they thinking, what happens if it was an earthquake situation on top of a pandemic, and you then look at, well, okay, what sort of government response do we have? What sort of UN type response do we have if our government's wiped out, if our emergency services or defence forces are wiped out? What other access do we have to maybe foreign partners and things like that? Like, how wide do you spread the net?
Well, luckily in Australia, they've got excellent escalation criteria and procedures. So if the local council runs out of resources, then it goes to the state. If the state, then it goes federal. If federal's running out of resources, then it comes internationally. And they've got that mapped out really, really well in Australia. So we're fortunate for that. If you have operations in other countries, it might not be that way. And then you really have to think about, okay, if we have a large-scale disaster in this particular country, what does that mean? Who would be able to respond? How do we liaise with them? So have those relationships pre-prepared, that's all I'm trying to say, so that you understand if there is a crisis of a certain scale of complexity or type, then I would need these sort of partners to liaise with. But if it gets to this level, I would need these sort of partners to liaise with. So if you go to Australian levels, you would make sure that you have those Australian escalation levels and organisations, which are very clearly explained in all the disaster management plans. That's excellent, very well communicated. But in other countries, you would have to really work out the local context.
And how does that work too? Like if you're, I guess, a partner to a foreign country, they've got a disaster and you've deployed your assets there, how does that work then when you might need to call them home? It's sort of a conflict of interest because you want to keep them at home, but you know, how are the capacity levels really measured in that situation as well?
You mean when you have expats, that people that are working there from the nationality of the country, or people
No, so say if there was a disaster in East Timor and Australian troops are deployed there to fix that, but then suddenly we have our own disasters at home. Mm-hmm. What happens there? Do we call them back? Do we pull our help? Do we... I mean,
Yes.
it might not even be, you might not even know the answer. It's
No, but
probably
that
a
is,
technical government response.
that all comes down to incident management, and that's the same as you would do for an organization. Okay, I've got these different problems going on. I've got a limited amount of resources. I think of what the consequences would be for each decision. So if I leave them there, these would be the consequences for my country, but I would do this great thing over there. If I'd bring them back, then I would assist here, but there would be the consequences, and just work out those consequences and then make the best decision.
Yeah.
In a disaster, there is no optimal decision.
No.
You just make the best decision with the best information that you have at that point in time, and you have to be quick about it, because the longer you wait, the less options you have available to you. So that's the difficulty, the conundrum between time and options.
It is. It's the capability, the capacity, the resource, and
that's a
juggling
constant
it.
juggling act in incident management. Absolutely.
I think communication's key too. I think Jacinda Ardern has been doing an amazing job, firstly when they had the terrorist attack, and with COVID-19 too. She's just been empathetic and communicating a lot.
Yes, what's going on? Why is it? Why are we doing this? What are the benefits? Strong leadership, unity in the country. I think Australia did an all right job as well, but there are certain other countries you can see if the leadership is constantly changing its mind, or it's not clear, or it's not even supporting what health officials are saying, then you can see that it all starts to fall apart very, very quickly. You need strong leadership. You need consultative leadership. So you do need someone in a leadership position that, again, consults all the different experts, considers all the different options that you have to respond, what the consequences are of that, and then takes a decisive decision and runs with that, and really explains to the community, to all stakeholders what that means, and that we're going to stick with this, but it will be great at the end because these and these are the consequences. Very good understanding of why decisions are being made.
Yeah,
and
it's
I think
that real leading change piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
100% input and 100% agreement, and
Yeah. So yes, she does an excellent job of that. Absolutely.
I think too, she made the decisions quite quickly early on. She could kind of envisage that it was going to play out the way it did, and took the hard lines straight away, instead of sort of, I guess, just waiting and sort of anticipating what might happen and allowing it to become a bigger problem.
Yeah, she has great insight of consequences early on, because I think a lot of people, especially in COVID-19, could not believe that this could be the case. So waited way too long, because Australians are like, oh, it'll be right, that'll never happen, it'll be fine. But it wasn't, and that's where, again, those indicators that you can see that something going down a certain path, that you act on those early. The earlier the better.
And have you seen some really poor examples of, resilience planning and risk management? Because really it comes back to the overall governance framework and that reporting line, sort of to the board where they're going to be making the decisions, but the sort of making sure it doesn't miss a certain channel on the way up the line and the way back down the line. That's where I think the big disconnect comes. But have you seen a really great examples or really poor examples of
in the
governance?
response to this?
Well, just in governance in general, and resilience planning in general.
I think the excellent examples are where the people managing the risk within the organisation are skilled and experienced and trained to understand risk, because you can't tell someone identify a risk or manage a risk that does not have the risk awareness. And it's something that really comes over time, or with training or with experience. It's not something that's per se natural. So that they have that, and then that capability to explain it to the board, what the risks are, why this is happening, why you need to take these measures, and explain that. And then it's very important that trust comes back and the support comes back, because people will only raise so many times that something needs to happen. If they get back, that'll be right, that'll never happen, no, you're not getting any money for that, or that, then people start to lose faith in the system, I suppose, and that's where it starts to fall down. Because then the board doesn't hear about it anymore, because people think there's no point anyway, or for the leadership team there's no point anyway, they don't really care anyway, and then it just doesn't work. So it's that really knowledge and understanding and ability to explain it up, and then the support and understanding down. And it doesn't mean you just have to throw money at everything. You have to scrutinize it. Absolutely, you have to scrutinize every idea, but you do have to make sure that you support. And if you don't give funding for a risk treatment strategy, then really explain why. We have really considered this is excellent that you brought this forward, and we do understand that there's a risk there. We think it's under the risk appetite because we can put this in place, and with these measures, just clear communication around that. I think that's where it works really, really well. If you don't do that, it really starts to fall down.
Yeah, they might just want to accept the risk as low as practical at that time, and maybe just transfer it by obtaining an insurance, which might be cheaper in the long run, and then they can work on the risk treatment in the background. And
I also think another important point is, if the leadership team keeps postponing the risk meetings, or putting it as a last agenda point, or not really saying that it's important that everyone has to update their risk register, but then don't update their part of it, that's a really bad message. You always have to lead by example and really demonstrate. Because I've been in those meetings, especially when you come new in an organisation where the CEO's joking about, this is so boring, or this is so stupid. like those sort of things. They have no idea the message that sends, how strong that is. I've seen these organizations where the CEO or the executive is really committed, and then everyone work that the achievements are so much greater than when the CEO goes, well, it's not really important anyway. Just a tick in the box, guys. Just a tick in the box. And then you're not going to get anywhere. You're honestly not going to get anywhere.
I think we've all worked in organisations.
It's all about believing, making everyone passionate about something, and then committing to it, and all sharing the benefits. And I think that's very important. Lead by example.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in risk management roles I've had is increasing that awareness, and it's sort of there's a lack of understanding in terms of definitions. So there's a lot of people who just want to view it as residual risk, when really it's theoretical, right? It's if you had all these things in place, that's where your residual risk would lead, but you really have to measure it on a current basis as well as a residual basis, and kind of see that mapped on the same risk heat map to really get an appreciation of, okay, well, is this as low as we can possibly get that risk? And are we happy to accept it at that level, or can we get it lower? Or if you're reporting on residual risk, people become complacent and go, oh no, that risk's being managed. And it's like, well, no, if you look at it from a current basis, you're actually over here. But it's that lack of understanding between inherent, current, residual.
Yes.
It's terminology in general, really.
It's sometimes like these debates. I'm sure you've been involved in them. Is it a 3 or a 4? And you sit there for an hour going on about is it a 3 or a 4? Yeah, does it really matter right now? But that's when people start to really despise risk management.
Yeah.
When you get bogged down in those sort of discussions.
Yeah.
So to make it as least technical as possible, and just let it live. Those top risks, work on those. Make it really enthusiastic that you're treating those risks. That's much better than those technicalities around.
And I think too,
ratings.
it's getting people to understand what elements they play into the overall strategy and what parts are foundational and operational in terms of, I try to position it to execs in sort of a bit of a vision and an analogy in terms of, well, if the strategy is the journey and the road you take to get there, and we've all agreed on the end destination, well, the obstacles along the way are the things that are managed by management. And say if you have a really large organisation, you might be leading a train and the CEO is the driver, and each of the business units, there's an exec responsible for each of the carriages. And some of those carriages might fall off, whether it's HR or IT or whatever, and if you lost that part of the train, are you still going to get there? And making sure, have you got the right fuel? Have you got the right equipment? Are you maintaining the wheels and things like that? Are you maintaining the tracks? And when you sort of position it like that, they go, oh yeah, that's okay. And in the risk management sort of framework is, well, who's responsible to put the fuel in the vehicle, and who's responsible for monitoring the track? And when everyone understands what part of the overall journey they're managing, I think it's a lot easier to help them report back on the bit that's in their remit, but also see it from the whole sort of journey perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right what you mentioned with who's doing the maintenance, because we all know a plan is like all these. You come into this organisation and they're 1 year where they did all the policies and procedures and plans and whatever, but then 3 years later they're completely out of date. But it's still in the risk register as this risk is treated because I have these plans and policies and procedures in place. But your processes have changed, people have changed, resources have changed. We're using different technology now, and those procedures and plans don't reflect that yet. So your risk has increased without being reflected in your risk register.
And we've seen a lot of regulatory change across all different industries as well, so that has a huge impact on them as well.
And that's so, especially in the aged care sector, I find that the compliance department. So the overheads in aged care are clearly very low already. I mean, the cost of labour and all the cost that comes with running an aged care facility are huge. But then the compliance, a list of regulations and everything, they kind of made it easier now with the latest aged care quality standard. But there's still so many things you have to consider and work out, and all the standards and guidelines, and then it says, you read that one and it says reference to this particular checklist, and then you go to that checklist and then there's another reference to this legislation, and it becomes this, how do you even work it out? And that's I think the responsibility of the regulators as well, to make sure that you're very clear on the expectations of an organization, because the organization don't necessarily have the resources to go through all these documentations and laws and regulations to really work out what then applies for their facility, and then work out the right terminology, like health and safety law. So I employ people, but a contractor, where they sit, and you have to try and work that out. It's just so complex.
They don't necessarily have the systems either in place to be able to monitor those.
No, and that's what I'm saying. Like the finance industry, we're also working in with the latest Commission for Inquiry. That is the Royal Commission. That's all the changes that came out of that, to try and stay on top of that. It's so difficult. That's a difficult one.
And I think too, you find a lot. Boards become complacent. They become so focused on financial risk and profitability that they forget to think about the non-financial emerging risks as well. And it was highlighted in the Royal Commission, culture and climate change, and not necessarily in the Royal Commission for that one, but climate change and modern slavery reporting and all those other things that they don't even consider as risks until they're knocking on their door going, well, this is potentially reputational damage, penalty damage, regulator relationship damage, erosion of trust, increase of public scrutiny, all those things.
It's huge, the secondary costs related to an incident. Like, for example, if you look at Volkswagen, they're promoting themselves as this environmentally friendly Integra company, and their whole branding, and they had very strong a brand reputation. And then they get found out for something that is clearly all the way to the top, because something does not accidentally come into a car.
No.
And that is clearly, okay, we're not environmentally friendly. We're actually trying to trick you to make it look so environmentally friendly. That completely undermines how we look at this brand. So they have to fix the problem of those things being in cars. They have to fix their reputation. They have to have legal fees through the roof. It affects on every aspect of their operation, and on a strategic level, for something like that.
And it's not easy to fix the reputation either.
No.
Once that rebuild the trust all over again.
Yes, and that is something that takes so long to rebuild, to build trust, and then something like that where you just lie to people, blatantly lie, and the regulators, you're lying, and that's difficult to recover from. But the secondary costs of such an incident are significant.
So I guess for organisations that don't necessarily look at resilience and risk management and business continuity planning and want to obtain independent assessments or advice, what sort of are the top 3 tips that you could give those types of organisations to at least increase their awareness initially?
Well, first I'd like to say the organisation, one of our customers that I got through the whole cycle with, they started with risk management. In the risk management, we identified, okay, there's certain aspects of health and safety we need to improve, certain aspect of quality management we need to improve. So those risk treatment plans got into play, that we have to treat these risks. So they started to treat those risks, and then they actually wanted to expand their business in a certain in a certain direction. And because they had all these procedures already in place, they had a fantastic risk management procedure that was written. They had their governance arrangements around that. They had their procedures because of the quality management system. They could put on all their safe. This proposal went out in like a day because they had everything done already. And they looked fantastic because they had passed audits, they had put all these systems in place, and had all this acknowledgement already of the risk treatments they put in place that positioned them in a really good way to expand their business. So if you think that risk management is not going to bring you in a better position to expand your business, then, I mean, it is the key to expanding your business. And the same, that organization that I worked with in Afghanistan, when I came with them, they had just won the first contract for one site. There was no policies, procedures in place yet. There was nothing in place yet. We're just starting operations. And I was responsible for quality, health, safety and environment, and later also risk and emergency management. But I put all those systems in place, and that's how we won all the other contracts. And within 4 years, we were the largest supplier in Afghanistan as well. We were operations in Somalia and Kosovo. We were doing disaster relief in Haiti, because we had built this really strong governance system, really strong quality management system. We were actually speaking on international conferences on how good our system was and how clean the fuel was, because we could prove it. And the management and the leadership really supported that, put the resources into building that system and looking at all the data that was coming in. So we had KPIs not just for the quality of the fuel, we had KPIs for procurement, finance, just the overarching for the business. We had management reports, all came under quality management, and we implemented the improvements and cascaded it back down. So we used that whole system to build the business from just one contract to contracts across multiple countries, multiple projects. And this stuff has value. This stuff puts you in an excellent position. And also we had an incident once where there was an air crash and they thought it was the fuel. And they come into your facility and we had all the checks and balances done. All staff was trained, all equipment was calibrated, samples were retained, daily checks were done, everything was in place. They could see records and reports dating back 3 months, so we were cleared straight away. And that's where the value comes in of those sort of things. It always sounds like, it's just a paper-generating activity, it's just so... but it's not. It protects your business, and it makes sure it sets you up for growth, because all this information, and when you go for a proposal, all this information needs to be there.
And I think too, like, the excitement for me comes from the ISO actually now looking at governance, and hopefully that comes out soon, and whistleblower programs, etc., and how they tie back into quality management, health and safety, risk, and kind of really aligning them all and making it all hum together, because then that feeds into our model where we really see that governance sits around all of your things, your strategy, your leadership, your culture, the behaviours, the sort of operational and risk management side, and really having an encompassing governance framework that sits around that. So if we have an ISO to work to in that space, it makes our job so much easier.
Yeah. Absolutely, because then it's very clear what the steps are, what needs to be done. Yep, you're compliant. And then you can also get that tick in a box. Because in most of the countries that I operated in, there's not that much regulatory monitoring going on. So they want customers want some confidence that you're doing the right thing. So then they'll start asking for ISO certificates. Because at least they know someone went in here, someone checked something and found it okay. It's better, at least you have some sort of assurance, right, that the right thing is being done, better than somebody just saying, yep, we've got great systems in place, because we all know you can say anything.
It's been validated.
Yeah, it's been validated, so that's very important.
Well, I think that probably wraps up where we're at today, and thank you so much for coming on the show, Lisa, and sharing all your valuable insights. It's always great to speak to someone who feels as passionate about risk and resilience and governance as much as what we do. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
That's all for today. Until next time, happy podcasting. And remember, if you're enjoying the show, check out our other episodes and all things governance at www.3wiseowls.com.au.